Sarah Martinez had always believed in fairy tales. At 26, she thought she had found her Prince Charming when she met David Thompson at a coffee shop in downtown Phoenix. He was everything she had dreamed of, tall, handsome, with kind eyes and a smile that made her heart skip a beat. David was a successful businessman who owned several properties around the city, and he treated Sarah like a queen from their very first date. Their romance moved quickly. David showered her with expensive gifts, took her to fancy restaurants, and whisked her away on weekend trips to romantic destinations. He was attentive, caring, and seemed genuinely interested in her dreams and aspirations. Sarah worked as a nurse at the local hospital, and David often praised her for her compassionate nature and dedication to helping others. He would say she had the biggest heart he had ever known, which made her feel special and loved. Within 8 months of dating, David proposed to Sarah during a sunset dinner overlooking the Grand Canyon. The proposal was everything she'd imagined, romantic, heartfelt, and surrounded by breathtaking beauty. The diamond ring was stunning, and David's words were perfect as he told her how much he loved her and wanted to spend the rest of his life making her happy. Sarah said yes without hesitation, tears of joy streaming down her face as she embraced the man she believed was her soulmate. The wedding planning process was a whirlwind of excitement. David insisted on handling most of the arrangements, claiming he wanted to give Sarah the wedding of her dreams without stressing her out. He chose an elegant venue, hired the best caterers, and even selected her wedding dress, saying he wanted everything to be perfect for his beautiful bride. Sarah was touched by his attention to detail and his desire to make their special day memorable. However, during their engagement, Sarah began to notice some peculiar things about David's behavior. He was very secretive about certain aspects of his life, particularly his business dealings and some of his properties. When she asked about visiting his other houses, he would always find excuses or change the subject. He claimed some were being renovated, others were being used for business purposes, and one was having foundation problems that made it unsafe to visit. David also had strict rules about their social life. He discouraged Sarah from spending too much time with her friends and family, claiming he wanted to protect their relationship from outside influences. He convinced her that some of her friends were jealous of their happiness and might try to cause problems between them. Gradually, Sarah found herself becoming more isolated from her support system, though she didn't realize it was happening deliberately. Despite these red flags, Sarah's love for David overshadowed her concerns. She told herself that every relationship had its quirks, and she focused on all the wonderful things about their partnership. David continued to be romantic and attentive, and she convinced herself that his protective nature came from a place of love rather than control. The wedding day finally arrived, and it was everything Sarah had dreamed of and more. She looked radiant in her white gown as she walked down the aisle toward David, who was waiting for her with tears in his eyes. The ceremony was beautiful, filled with love, laughter, and promises of forever. Their guests celebrated late into the night, and Sarah felt like the luckiest woman in the world as she danced with her new husband under the twinkling lights. After their honeymoon in Europe, Sarah moved into David's main residence, a large, beautiful house in an upscale neighborhood. The house was impressive, with spacious rooms, elegant furnishings, and a stunning garden. David had told her it would be their forever home, the place where they would build their life together and maybe someday raise a family. Sarah was excited to start this new chapter of her life as Mrs. Thompson. However, Sarah soon discovered that married life with David was different from their courtship. He became more controlling and possessive, monitoring her activities and questioning her whereabouts whenever she left the house. He installed security cameras throughout their home, claiming it was for their protection, but Sarah began to feel like she was being watched constantly. When she expressed her discomfort, David would dismiss her concerns and remind her how much he loved her and wanted to keep her safe. David also became increasingly secretive about his business activities. He would receive mysterious phone calls at all hours, speaking in hushed tones and often leaving the house for unexplained meetings. When Sarah asked about his work, he would become defensive and tell her not to worry about such things, saying that her job was to focus on being a good wife and making their home comfortable. Despite her growing unease, Sarah tried to be the perfect wife David seemed to expect. She cooked his favorite meals, kept the house spotless, and did everything she could to make him happy. She hoped that with time, their marriage would return to the loving partnership she had experienced during their courtship. However, the man she had fallen in love with seemed to be disappearing, replaced by someone she barely recognized. 3 months into their marriage, Sarah's world began to crumble in ways she never could have imagined. David's behavior became increasingly erratic and controlling. He started monitoring her phone calls, checking her text messages, and demanding detailed explanations for every minute she spent away from home. He installed additional locks on all the doors and windows, claiming it was for security purposes. But Sarah began to feel like she was living in a prison rather than a home. The most disturbing change was David's attitude toward her work at the hospital. He had initially been supportive of her nursing career, but now he constantly complained about her schedule and the time she spent caring for patients. He began pressuring her to quit her job, arguing that as his wife she shouldn't need to work since he could provide for both of them financially. Sarah loved her career and found purpose in helping sick people recover, but David's persistent arguments and emotional manipulation began to wear her down. One evening, while David was supposedly at a business meeting, Sarah decided to do some cleaning in areas of the house she rarely visited. As she was dusting in David's home office, she accidentally knocked over a small wooden box on his desk. The contents spilled onto the floor, revealing something that made her blood run cold. Among the scattered papers were photographs of women, dozens of them. These weren't ordinary photos. They appeared to be surveillance pictures taken without the subject's knowledge. Sarah's hands trembled as she examined the images more closely. Some photos showed women going about their daily activities, shopping, walking to their cars, entering buildings. Others were more disturbing, appearing to have been taken through windows or from hiding spots. At the bottom of the pile, she found a notebook filled with detailed information about these women, their names, addresses, daily routines, work schedules, and even personal details about their families and relationships. Her heart pounded as she recognized some of the faces in the photographs. A few of the women looked familiar from news reports about missing persons cases in the area over the past several years. Sarah's mind raced as she tried to process what she was seeing. The man she had married, the man she had trusted with her heart and her future, appeared to be involved in something far more sinister than she had ever imagined. Before she could fully comprehend the implications of her discovery, Sarah heard David's car pulling into the driveway. Panic seized her as she quickly gathered the photos and papers, attempting to return them to the box exactly as she had found them. Her hands shook so violently that she could barely manage the simple task. She managed to place everything back and return the box to its original position, just as she heard David's key in the front door lock. David entered the house, calling her name in his usual cheerful tone. As if nothing unusual had happened, Sarah tried to compose herself and respond normally, but her voice came out strained and unnatural. When David found her in his office, she quickly explained that she was cleaning and had accidentally disturbed his desk. She watched his face carefully for any sign of suspicion or anger, but he simply smiled and thanked her for taking such good care of their home. That night, Sarah lay awake in bed next to her husband, her mind racing with questions and fears. Who were those women in the photographs? What had David done to them? Was she living with a dangerous criminal? The man sleeping peacefully beside her suddenly seemed like a complete stranger, and she realized how little she actually knew about his past or his current activities. Over the following days, Sarah tried to act normally while secretly investigating David's background. She searched online for news articles about missing women in their area, and was horrified to find several cases that seemed to match some of the faces from the photographs. The similarities were too numerous to be coincidental, and Sarah began to suspect that her husband might be involved in human trafficking, or something even worse. Sarah also started paying closer attention to David's daily routine and business activities. She noticed that he often left the house late at night, claiming he had emergency business meetings or property inspections that couldn't wait until morning. He would return in the early hours of the morning, sometimes with dirt on his clothes or a strange smell that she couldn't identify. When she asked about these late-night excursions, David would become irritated and remind her that his business dealings were none of her concern. The isolation that David had gradually imposed on Sarah during their engagement now felt more sinister and deliberate. She realized that he had systematically cut her off from her support system, making it difficult for her to seek help or confide in anyone about her growing concerns. Her friends rarely called anymore, assuming she was too busy with her new married life to maintain their friendships. Her family lived several states away, and David had discouraged frequent contact with them. Despite her fear, Sarah knew she needed to learn more about what David was really involved in. She began documenting his strange behavior, noting the times he left the house, his mood when he returned, and any unusual phone calls or visitors. She also started researching the missing women cases more thoroughly, trying to find connections between them and her husband's activities. As Sarah delved deeper into her investigation, she discovered that several of David's properties were located in remote areas outside the city. These were the same properties he had always claimed were under renovation or had safety issues that prevented her from visiting them. Sarah began to suspect that these isolated locations might be where David was conducting whatever illegal activities he was involved in. The weight of her discoveries was becoming unbearable, but Sarah felt trapped in her situation. She had no concrete evidence of wrongdoing, only suspicious photographs and her growing intuition that something was terribly wrong. She feared that if she confronted David or went to the police without solid proof, he might become dangerous or simply disappear, potentially harming other innocent women in the process. Sarah's determination to uncover the truth about her husband's activities grew stronger with each passing day. She decided she needed to find a way to visit one of David's mysterious properties to see what he was hiding. Her opportunity came when David announced he would be traveling to another state for business meetings that would keep him away for 3 days. This was the longest he had ever left her alone since their marriage, and Sarah suspected it might be her only chance to investigate. On the morning of David's departure, Sarah acted like the loving wife he expected her to be. She prepared his favorite breakfast, helped him pack his suitcase, and kissed him goodbye at the door with a smile that masked her true intentions. As soon as his car disappeared from view, Sarah began executing the plan she had been secretly developing for weeks. Sarah had managed to find the address of David's property that was supposedly undergoing foundation repairs. It was located about 45 minutes outside the city in a rural area, surrounded by farmland and sparse vegetation. She had memorized the route and planned to visit during daylight hours, when she would be less likely to attract attention from neighbors or passers-by. The drive to the property felt like the longest 45 minutes of Sarah's life. Her heart raced with anticipation and fear as she navigated the winding country roads that led to David's secret location. She had no idea what she might find there, but she knew she couldn't continue living with the uncertainty and growing dread that had consumed her thoughts for weeks. When Sarah finally reached the address, she found a modest 2-story house set back from the road and partially hidden by overgrown trees and bushes. The property appeared neglected from the outside, with peeling paint, broken shutters, and an unkempt yard that contradicted David's usual attention to detail. There was no sign of any foundation work or renovation equipment that would support his claims about the property's condition. Sarah parked her car down the road and walked back to the house, her pulse quickening with each step. The windows were covered with heavy curtains that prevented her from seeing inside, and the front door was secured with multiple locks that seemed excessive for a house that was supposedly empty and under repair. She walked around the perimeter of the building looking for any way to see inside or gain access. As she approached the back of the house, Sarah heard something that made her freeze in terror. It was a sound she recognized from her years working as a nurse, the unmistakable sound of human suffering. Someone inside the house was crying, and the sound was filled with desperation and pain that pierced Sarah's heart. She realized that whatever David was involved in, there was someone inside this house who needed help immediately. Sarah crept closer to the back of the house and discovered a small basement window that was partially covered by boards. Through a gap between the boards, she could see into what appeared to be a basement room. What she saw there would haunt her for the rest of her life. A young woman, probably in her early 20s, was chained to a wall in conditions that were absolutely horrific. The woman appeared to be severely malnourished and showed obvious signs of abuse and neglect. She was dressed in tattered clothing and sat on a dirty mattress in a room that reeked of human waste and despair. The chains that held her were heavy and appeared to have caused wounds on her wrists and ankles from constant rubbing against her skin. Sarah could see other restraints and disturbing equipment in the room that suggested this woman had been held captive for a significant period of time. Sarah's medical training kicked in as she assessed the woman's condition from what she could see through the small window. The captive appeared to be in serious physical distress, likely suffering from malnutrition, dehydration, and various infections. Sarah realized that this woman needed immediate medical attention, and that every minute of delay could be putting her life in further danger. The reality of her discovery hit Sarah like a physical blow. Her husband was not just involved in some vague criminal activity. He was holding a woman prisoner in conditions that amounted to torture. Sarah's mind raced as she tried to process the implications. How long had this woman been here? Were there others? How many women had David abducted and held in similar conditions? Sarah tried to get the woman's attention by tapping gently on the window. The captive looked up with eyes that reflected both hope and terror. Sarah gestured that she was there to help and tried to communicate silently, that she would return with assistance. The woman seemed to understand and nodded weakly, tears streaming down her face as she realized that someone had finally found her. As much as Sarah wanted to break down the door and rescue the woman immediately, she knew she needed to be smart about her approach. The house was secured with multiple locks, and she didn't have the tools or strength to break through them quickly. More importantly, she needed to ensure that David wouldn't return unexpectedly and find her there, which could put both her and the captive woman in even greater danger. Sarah made the difficult decision to leave the property temporarily so she could contact the police and get proper help for the woman in the basement. She took several photos with her phone of the outside of the house and the basement window, making sure to document the location and condition of the property. She also made note of the exact time and any other details that might be important for law enforcement. The drive back to town was a blur of conflicting emotions. Sarah felt overwhelming guilt about leaving the woman behind, even temporarily. But she knew that getting professional help was the only way to ensure a safe rescue. She also felt a crushing sense of betrayal and horror as she realized the true nature of the man she had married. The fairy tale romance she had believed in was nothing more than an elaborate lie designed to hide David's monstrous activities. Sarah's hands shook as she drove, and she had to pull over several times to compose herself. The image of the woman in chains was burned into her memory, and she couldn't stop thinking about what that poor person had endured during her captivity. Sarah knew that her own life was about to change dramatically once she reported what she had discovered, but she also knew that she had no choice but to act quickly to save the woman who was depending on her for rescue. Began to suspect that these isolated locations might be where David was conducting whatever illegal activities he was involved in. The weight of her discoveries was becoming unbearable, but Sarah felt trapped in her situation. She had no concrete evidence of wrongdoing, only suspicious photographs and her growing intuition that something was terribly wrong. She feared that if she confronted David or went to the police without solid proof, he might become dangerous or simply disappear, potentially harming other innocent women in the process. Sarah drove straight to the nearest police station, her mind racing with how to explain the unbelievable situation she had discovered. She knew that her story sounded like something from a horror movie, and she worried that the police might not believe her, or might think she was making false accusations against her husband. However, the memory of the woman's desperate face gave her the courage she needed to walk through the police station doors. Detective Maria Rodriguez was assigned to Sarah's case after she reported what she had found at David's property. Detective Rodriguez was an experienced officer who specialized in missing persons and human trafficking cases, and she immediately recognized the serious nature of Sarah's claims. She listened carefully as Sarah explained everything from finding the photographs in David's office to discovering the woman chained in the basement. The detective was particularly interested in the photographs Sarah had seen, as they matched the description of evidence that law enforcement had been seeking in connection with several missing persons cases. Detective Rodriguez explained that David Thompson had actually been under surveillance for months as part of a larger investigation into human trafficking activities in the region. But police had been unable to gather enough evidence to obtain search warrants for his properties. Sarah's eyewitness account of the captive woman provided the crucial evidence that law enforcement needed to take immediate action. Detective Rodriguez quickly organized a rescue operation that would involve multiple agencies, including the FBI, local SWAT teams, and medical personnel who could provide immediate care for any victims they might find. Within hours of Sarah's report, a coordinated law enforcement operation was underway. Sarah was asked to accompany the police to ensure they could locate the exact property and the basement window where she had seen the captive woman. The drive back to David's property was surreal for Sarah, as she found herself in the middle of a convoy of police vehicles racing to save a woman whose name she didn't even know. When the law enforcement team arrived at the property, they moved quickly and efficiently. SWAT officers secured the perimeter, while other officers worked to breach the multiple locks on the doors. Sarah watched from a safe distance as the rescue operation unfolded, her heart pounding as she prayed that the woman was still alive and that they wouldn't be too late to save her. The sound of the basement door being broken down echoed across the property, followed by shouts from officers who had found the captive woman. Sarah felt a mixture of relief and horror as she heard the commotion inside the house. Relief that the woman was still alive, but horror at the confirmation that her worst fears about David's activities were true. Emergency. Medical personnel rushed into the basement and immediately began providing care for the woman Sarah had found. She was carefully removed from her chains and transported to the hospital, where Sarah's colleagues in the nursing department would help care for her recovery. Sarah learned that the woman's name was Jessica Martinez, and she was 23 years old when she had been abducted 8 months earlier while walking home from work. As the rescue operation continued, law enforcement officers discovered evidence of David's crimes throughout the property. In addition to Jessica, they found restraints and equipment that had clearly been used to hold multiple victims over an extended period. The basement had been converted into a makeshift prison with multiple cells, suggesting that David had been operating his human trafficking scheme for years. The investigation team also uncovered detailed records that David had kept of his criminal activities. These records included information about dozens of women he had targeted, abducted, and trafficked to buyers across the country. Sarah was horrified to learn that her husband had been running a sophisticated criminal operation that had destroyed countless lives while he was presenting himself to her as a loving, successful businessman. Detective Rodriguez explained to Sarah that David's marriage to her had likely been part of his criminal strategy. By appearing to be a happily married man with a respectable wife who worked as a nurse, David had created a perfect cover for his illegal activities. Sarah's profession and reputation in the community had provided him with social credibility that helped deflect suspicion from law enforcement and potential victims. The detective also revealed that David's other properties were being searched simultaneously, and early reports suggested that they would find evidence of additional victims and crimes. The scope of David's criminal enterprise was far larger than Sarah had imagined, and she realized that she had unknowingly been living with one of the most dangerous criminals in the state. As news of the rescue operation spread, Sarah found herself at the center of a media storm. Reporters wanted to interview the wife who had discovered her husband's crimes and helped save Jessica Martinez's life. Sarah struggled with the attention, as she felt guilty for not discovering David's true nature sooner and for the suffering that had occurred while she was living unknowingly in the same house as a monster. Sarah's family and friends rallied around her during this difficult time, providing emotional support as she processed the trauma of learning that her entire marriage had been built on lies and deception. Her parents flew in from out of state to be with her, and her colleagues at the hospital offered their assistance in any way they could. The legal process began almost immediately, with Sarah being asked to provide testimony and evidence that would help prosecutors build their case against David. She learned that David had been arrested at the airport when he attempted to flee the country after learning about the police raid on his property. Sarah felt a sense of justice knowing that he would not be able to harm anyone else, but she also felt overwhelmed by the legal proceedings that lay ahead. Jessica Martinez was recovering in the hospital under heavy security, as law enforcement was concerned that David might have associates who could try to harm her before she could testify against him. Sarah requested permission to visit Jessica, feeling a deep connection to the woman whose life she had helped save. When they finally met, it was an emotional encounter that neither woman would ever forget. Jessica thanked Sarah for her courage in reporting what she had found and for not turning away when she could have chosen to protect herself instead. Sarah apologized for not discovering the truth sooner, but Jessica assured her that she was not responsible for David's crimes and that her actions had likely saved not only Jessica's life, but the lives of many other potential victims. The investigation into David's criminal activities continued to expand as law enforcement agencies uncovered the full scope of his human trafficking operation. Search warrants were executed on all of David's properties, revealing a network of locations where he had held victims over the years. The evidence was overwhelming and painted a picture of systematic abuse that had been going on for nearly a decade. At David's primary warehouse property, investigators found a sophisticated operation complete with holding cells, surveillance equipment, and detailed records of financial transactions with buyers across the country and internationally. The records showed that David had been trafficking women to wealthy clients who paid enormous sums for what they believed would be undetectable crimes. The profits from his illegal activities had funded his legitimate businesses and provided him with the resources to maintain his respectable public image. Sarah cooperated fully with law enforcement, providing them with access to David's personal belongings, financial records, and anything else that might help their investigation. She discovered that their joint bank accounts contained money that had been earned through the suffering of innocent women, and she immediately signed over all assets to a fund that would be used to provide compensation and support for David's victims. The emotional toll of the investigation was enormous for Sarah. She had to relive the horror of her discoveries repeatedly as she provided testimony to police, FBI agents, prosecutors, and eventually a grand jury. Each time she told her story, she was forced to confront the reality that she had been married to a monster who had manipulated her emotions and used her as an unwitting accomplice in his crimes. Sarah also struggled with intense guilt and self-doubt. She constantly questioned whether she should have recognized the signs of David's criminal behavior sooner, and whether her failure to do so had resulted in additional suffering for his victims. Despite reassurances from law enforcement and victim advocates that she was not responsible for David's actions, Sarah found it difficult to forgive herself for being deceived so completely. The media attention surrounding the case was intense and often intrusive. Sarah's photo appeared on news websites and television broadcasts across the country as the story of the nurse who exposed her husband's human trafficking ring captured public attention. While many people praised Sarah for her courage and quick action, others questioned how she could have been unaware of such serious crimes happening so close to her. Sarah made the difficult decision to take a leave of absence from her nursing job to focus on her mental health and the legal proceedings. The hospital was supportive of her decision and assured her that her position would be available when she felt ready to return to work. Her colleagues in the nursing department had been following the case closely and understood the trauma she was experiencing. As more victims were identified and rescued from David's network, Sarah realized the true magnitude of what her discovery had accomplished. Law enforcement agencies across multiple states were able to dismantle related criminal organizations and rescue dozens of women who had been trapped in similar situations. The evidence from David's operation led to arrests of buyers, suppliers, and other traffickers who had been operating with impunity for years. Sarah decided to attend some of the court hearings where David's victims provided testimony about their experiences. Hearing their stories was heartbreaking, but also helped Sarah understand the impact of her decision to report what she had found. Many of the women spoke directly to Sarah, thanking her for her bravery and telling her that her actions had given them hope during their darkest moments. Jessica Martinez became a close friend and ally for Sarah during this difficult period. Despite the trauma they had both experienced, Jessica showed remarkable strength and resilience as she worked with prosecutors to build the strongest possible case against David. She also became an advocate for other trafficking victims, using her experience to help law enforcement improve their response to these crimes. The friendship between Sarah and Jessica was built on their shared experience, but grew into a genuine bond based on mutual respect and understanding. Jessica helped Sarah process her guilt and trauma by explaining that victims of manipulation and deception should never blame themselves for the actions of their abusers. Sarah, in turn, provided Jessica with emotional support and practical assistance as she rebuilt her life after months of captivity. David's trial began nearly a year after his arrest, and it was one of the most closely watched criminal cases in the state's history. Sarah was called as a key witness for the prosecution, and her testimony about discovering the photographs and finding Jessica in the basement was crucial to establishing the timeline and scope of David's crimes. Despite the emotional difficulty of facing her former husband in court, Sarah provided clear and compelling testimony that helped convince the jury of David's guilt. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence of David's crimes, including testimony from multiple victims, financial records showing payments from buyers, and physical evidence from his properties. David's defense team attempted to argue that he was the victim of a larger criminal organization and had been coerced into participating in the trafficking operation, but their arguments were unconvincing, given the extensive evidence of his leadership role and the profits he had earned. During the trial, additional details emerged about how David had targeted his victims. He had specifically chosen young women who were isolated or vulnerable, often approaching them in public places where he could present himself as a helpful and trustworthy person. His marriage to Sarah had been part of his strategy to appear normal and respectable, providing him with cover for his criminal activities. Sarah also learned during the trial that David had been planning to involve her, more directly, in his criminal operation. Prosecutors revealed that he had been gradually isolating her from her support system and pressuring her to quit her job as preparation for forcing her to participate in recruiting and managing victims. The realization that she had been intended as both a cover and a potential accomplice made Sarah feel sick but also grateful that she had discovered his true nature before he could implement those plans. The evidence presented during the trial also revealed that David's criminal network extended far beyond what Sarah had initially discovered. He had connections to trafficking operations in other states and countries, and his arrest had helped law enforcement agencies disrupt international criminal networks that had been operating for decades. Sarah felt a sense of pride knowing that her decision to investigate her suspicions had contributed to such significant law enforcement success. The jury deliberated for only 6 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges against David Thompson. He was convicted of human trafficking, kidnapping, sexual assault, and numerous other felonies that carried a potential sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole. Sarah felt a mixture of relief and closure as she heard the verdict read aloud in the packed courtroom, surrounded by victims, their families, and the law enforcement officers who had worked tirelessly to bring David to justice. During the sentencing phase of the trial, Sarah was given the opportunity to provide a victim impact statement describing how David's deception and crimes had affected her life. She spoke about the betrayal she felt upon discovering that her marriage had been built on lies, and her ongoing struggle to trust her own judgment after being manipulated so completely. She also emphasized her commitment to helping other victims and supporting efforts to combat human trafficking. David was ultimately sentenced to multiple life terms in prison without the possibility of parole, ensuring that he would never again have the opportunity to harm innocent women. As the judge pronounced the sentence, Sarah felt a sense of justice for Jessica and all the other victims whose lives had been destroyed by David's crimes. The sentence also provided her with a measure of closure, knowing that the man who had manipulated and deceived her would spend the rest of his life paying for his actions. Following the trial, Sarah made the decision to divorce David and legally change her name back to her maiden name. The divorce proceedings were complicated by the criminal nature of David's activities and the need to ensure that all assets connected to his trafficking operation were properly seized and distributed to his victims. Sarah worked closely with victim advocates and attorneys to ensure that the legal process was handled appropriately and that she did not inadvertently benefit from David's criminal profits. Sarah also made the difficult decision to sell the house where she had lived with David, as she could no longer bear to be in the place where she had been so thoroughly deceived. The proceeds from the sale were donated to organizations that support trafficking victims, and Sarah moved into a smaller apartment where she could begin rebuilding her life without the constant reminders of her traumatic marriage. Returning to work as a nurse proved to be both challenging and therapeutic for Sarah. Her colleagues were supportive and understanding, but Sarah initially struggled with anxiety and hypervigilance that made it difficult to focus on her patients. However, her experience with David's victims had given her unique insights into trauma and recovery that made her an even more compassionate and effective healthcare provider. Sarah began specializing in caring for patients who had experienced trauma, including victims of domestic violence, sexual assault, and human trafficking. Her personal experience, combined with additional training and education, made her uniquely qualified to provide sensitive care to these vulnerable populations. She found deep meaning in her work and felt that her traumatic experience had given her the tools to help others heal from similar trauma. Jessica Martinez completed her physical recovery and began the longer process of emotional healing with the support of therapists, victim advocates, and her growing friendship with Sarah. She testified at several related trials that resulted from the investigation into David's network, helping prosecutors secure convictions against numerous other traffickers and buyers. Jessica's courage and resilience inspired Sarah and many others who followed her story. 2 years after David's conviction, Sarah and Jessica co-founded a nonprofit organization dedicated to supporting trafficking survivors and educating the public about the warning signs of human trafficking. Their organization provides emergency housing, medical care, legal assistance, and counseling services for survivors while also conducting training programs for healthcare workers, law enforcement officers, and community members. Sarah's personal experience as someone who unknowingly lived with a trafficker gave her unique credibility. When speaking to community groups about the sophisticated ways that criminals can hide their activities, she emphasized that trafficking can happen anywhere and that perpetrators often appear to be normal, successful members of the community. Her presentations helped dispel myths about trafficking and educated audiences about how to recognize potential signs of these crimes. The nonprofit organization that Sarah and Jessica founded grew rapidly, expanding to serve survivors throughout their region and eventually opening satellite offices in other states. Their work attracted national attention, and Sarah became a sought-after speaker at conferences on human trafficking, victim services, and trauma recovery. She used her platform to advocate for stronger laws against trafficking and better resources for survivors. Sarah eventually found love again with Dr. Michael Chen, a trauma surgeon who shared her commitment to helping victims of violence. Their relationship developed slowly and was built on mutual respect, shared values, and complete honesty about their backgrounds and experiences. Michael had extensive experience treating victims of violent crimes and understood the trauma that Sarah had experienced without needing detailed explanations. 5 years after David's conviction, Sarah and Michael were married in a small, private ceremony attended by close friends and family, including Jessica Martinez, who served as Sarah's maid of honor. The wedding was a celebration of Sarah's healing journey and her ability to trust and love again after experiencing such profound betrayal. Unlike her first wedding, this ceremony was based on complete honesty and genuine partnership. Sarah's story became the subject of a documentary film that helped raise awareness about human trafficking and the ways that perpetrators manipulate their victims in their communities. The film featured interviews with Sarah, Jessica, and other survivors, as well as law enforcement officers and victim advocates who worked on the case. The documentary won several awards and was credited with increasing public understanding of trafficking issues. Today, Sarah continues her work as both a nurse and an advocate for trafficking survivors. She has testified before Congress about the need for better training for healthcare workers to recognize signs of trafficking and has consulted with law enforcement agencies about improving their response to these crimes. Her traumatic experience with David ultimately became a source of strength and purpose that allowed her to save countless other lives. Sarah often reflects on how different her life might have been if she had not found the courage to investigate her suspicions about David's behavior. The woman she discovered chained in that basement could have died in captivity, and dozens of other victims might never have been rescued. Her decision to trust her instincts and take action despite her fear had ripple effects that extended far beyond what she could have imagined. The relationship between Sarah and Jessica remains strong, built on their shared experience and their commitment to helping other survivors. Jessica completed her college degree and became a social worker specializing in trauma recovery. Together, they have created a model program for survivor services that has been replicated in communities across the country. Sarah's marriage to Michael has provided her with the stable, loving partnership she had originally hoped to find with David. Michael understands the importance of Sarah's advocacy work and supports her efforts to help trafficking survivors. They have 2 young children who are being raised with a strong understanding of social justice and the importance of helping those in need. The nonprofit organization that Sarah and Jessica founded has grown into a nationally recognized leader in anti-trafficking efforts, Their work has helped rescue hundreds of victims and has trained thousands of professionals to better recognize and respond to trafficking situations. The organization also conducts research that has contributed to improved policies and practices in law enforcement, healthcare, and social services. Sarah has written a book about her experience that became a bestseller and has been translated into multiple languages. The proceeds from the book support her nonprofit organization and have helped expand their services to reach more survivors. Sarah uses her platform as an author to continue raising awareness about trafficking and encouraging others to trust their instincts when they suspect something is wrong. Looking back on her journey, Sarah recognizes that her traumatic experience with David fundamentally changed her understanding of herself and her place in the world. While she would never wish such an experience on anyone, she has found meaning and purpose in using her story to help others. Her courage in facing an unimaginable situation has inspired countless people to take action when they encounter injustice or suffering. The case against David Thompson and his criminal network continues to have lasting impacts on law enforcement practices and public awareness of human trafficking. The evidence gathered during the investigation has been used to train officers, prosecutors, and victim advocates across the country. Sarah's story has become a teaching tool that demonstrates both the sophisticated ways that traffickers operate and the importance of community members who are willing to report suspicious activities. Sarah's transformation from a woman who thought she had found her fairy tale romance to a nationally recognized advocate for trafficking survivors represents the power of resilience and the ability to find purpose in even the most traumatic experiences. Her story continues to inspire others who have faced betrayal, trauma, or difficult circumstances to believe that healing and meaningful action are possible even after the most devastating discoveries.